There are moments in life when silence becomes too heavy to carry, when memories press against your heart with such force that they must be spoken aloud. I have spent years choosing quiet over visibility, reflection over reaction. But now, as the church finds itself on the brink of profound transition, and as the world begins to whisper again about who will wear the white robes, I feel compelled to share what I have seen, what I have lived. This is not a campaign. It is not a doctrine. It is a testimony, a sister's story, a witness to a man who taught me that power means nothing if it cannot weep. I remember him long before he became a symbol, long before the headlines, the cameras, the immense responsibility of the papacy. To me, Jorge was simply my brother. He was a boy with ink-stained fingers who loved books more than toys, who danced with me in the kitchen while our mother sang and the stew simmered on the stove. His laughter was light then, unburdened, but his eyes always carried something older, deeper, a weight he didn't yet have words for. Even as children, I knew he was different, not in the way people speak of greatness, but in the way a candle stands in a dark room, quiet, but undeniable. I used to watch him study late into the night. While the rest of us slept, he would sit hunched over the kitchen table, whispering prayers between pages of scripture. Our father, Mario, worked long hours on the railway, and our mother, Regina, held the household together with prayer and quiet strength. In that environment, Jorge grew into his convictions the way roots grow into soil, slowly, invisibly, but with unshakable purpose. I didn't know then that I was witnessing the birth of a calling. All I knew was that my brother moved through the world as if he were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. He had a way of protecting people, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a presence that made you feel safe. When I was teased at school, he was the one who walked me home, books clutched in his arms, offering silence as comfort more often than advice. He stood between me and the world, not because he had to, but because it was in his nature to shield. Later, when our uncle fell into addiction, it was Jorge, barely out of boyhood, who stood at the doorway and said, "Not like this," barring him entry until he could come clean. Not from shame, but from love. That was the kind of strength he carried. When he chose the seminary, there was no celebration in our home. No applause, no announcements. Just a quiet dinner, the clinking of forks, and the deep understanding that something had changed forever. We knew we were letting go of Jorge, not losing him, but releasing him to something far greater than any of us could comprehend. He didn't seek the priesthood for ambition. He sought it because he couldn't not. It was in him, like breath, like rhythm. He didn't talk about God with authority. He talked about God with intimacy, as if he were someone Jorge had known personally for years. Even then, I could see how people began to gather around him, not because he demanded attention, but because he made them feel seen. There's a power in humility that the world often overlooks. Jorge never sought to lead, but people followed him because they trusted him. He spoke the hard truths, but he spoke them with love. He wasn't afraid to confront injustice, but he did it with a softness that disarmed anger. The church didn't make him who he was. It revealed who he had always been. The cassock didn't crown him. It exposed the cross he'd been carrying all along. When he became pope, I wasn't surprised. I was heartbroken. Not because I didn't believe he could carry the weight, but because I knew how heavy it would be. I had seen the toll leadership took on him even before Rome. His shoulders didn't rise with pride, they stooped with responsibility. The world cheered, cameras flashed, but I saw in his face a quiet ache, a knowing. Power had never been his goal. Service had always been his surrender. And when the white robe settled on his frame, I feared what they might steal from him, his laughter, his gentleness, his soul. Now, as the bells of Rome prepare to ring again, I find myself returning to those early days, before the Vatican, before the applause, before the expectations, to the boy who made soup and folded laundry and whispered prayers while the rest of us slept. The world remembers the Pope. I remember the brother. And as the church prepares to choose once more, I pray it does not forget what kind of heart it truly needs. Not one that commands, but one that kneels, one that bleeds, one that sees. One like Jorge's. He once told me that leadership wasn't about brilliance, but about burden. That if a man ever found joy in being above others, he should step down immediately. Jorge never chased prestige. In fact, He recoiled from it. He used to say, "If people are applauding, make sure it's not because you've stopped speaking truth." That stayed with me. I watched as he rose in rank, not because he desired it, but because he was always the one others trusted to carry what was difficult. And in that trust, he suffered. But he never allowed that suffering to make him cynical. He carried it like Christ carried the cross, not with bitterness, but with fierce love. In one of our last long conversations, long before the world whispered about successors and conclaves, Jorge mentioned a name I had never heard before: Cardinal Luis Tagle. At first, it was in passing, a quiet reference over a cup of tea. But as he spoke, I realized something. This wasn't just admiration, it was concern. Jorge saw in him a reflection of something raw and rare. A man who didn't just preach the gospel but felt it, carried it in his posture, in his tears, in his stillness. Jorge said, "He reminds me of what the church sounded like before we got used to our own echo." I didn't fully understand then, but now I do. He worried for him, not because of a flaw, but because of a gift. That kind of heart, Jorge said, doesn't last long in Rome unless it's wrapped in armor. He feared that an institution built on centuries of structure might not be ready for someone who led with softness instead of sharpness. And I knew, even in his careful phrasing, that Jorge was speaking not just of Tagle, but of himself, of what it cost him to remain gentle in a world that mistook gentleness for weakness. He never lost his mercy, but I watched it wear on him. Rome is beautiful, sacred, but it is also ruthless in ways only those inside can see. That night over tea, Jorge's eyes grew heavy. He didn't speak as a pope. He spoke as a man who had seen too much, carried too much, and still believed too much to walk away. He said, "If the next man doesn't know how to cry for the world, we've chosen wrong." He didn't say it dramatically. He said it like a sigh, like a prayer. That's when I realized that he wasn't preparing for succession. He was preparing his soul for surrender. He knew his time was not endless. He had begun to speak more often of legacy, not in terms of achievements, but of hearts. Hearts that could still break for the poor, for the voiceless, for the forgotten. Jorge never wanted applause. He wanted a church that remembered. A church that still smelled like the streets it walked on. That's why he lived simply. Why he kept his shoes worn, his windows open, his routines grounded. Not as symbols, as survival. He feared forgetting the hunger of the poor, the chill of sleeping outside church walls, the sting of injustice. He believed that the higher you rise, the more desperately you must reach downward, and that if you ever forget the weight of a wooden bench beneath your knees, you are no longer fit to lead. That was his compass, and it never wavered. He told me once that the Vatican was the holiest place he'd ever lived, and also the loneliest. He said that holiness without humility becomes theater, and that theater eventually forgets its audience. That's what frightened him. Not scandal, not numbers. Drift. Quiet drift away from the gospel's core. He said, "Collapse, I could respond to. But drift happens while everyone claps." That was Jorge's sorrow, that the church he loved could slowly lose its heartbeat while appearing more polished than ever. He fought against that, not with decrees, but with presence, with touch, with listening, with tears behind closed doors. And so when he spoke of Tagle, it wasn't to anoint him, it was to protect him. He said, "That man has something rare, but if he's chosen, pray not that he leads well, but that he survives it." That's the line I can't forget, because I saw what Jorge had to survive. The nights he couldn't sleep, the weight of contradiction, the ache of knowing he could only change so much, so fast, before the machinery of tradition pushed back. He wasn't asking the church to evolve for evolution's sake. He was asking it to return, to mercy, to mission, to Christ in the alleyway, not just Christ on the altar. That was his revolution. I remember a letter he wrote me just months before his health began to fade. It wasn't long, but every word was soaked in something I'd never seen from him before. Grief. Not the grief of impending death. Jorge didn't fear dying. It was the grief of a shepherd watching his flock wander in all directions, too scattered to hear his voice. He wrote, "I cry not for myself, but for what's ahead, for a church that risks forgetting who it was called to be." He didn't blame anyone. That was never his way. But he mourned the distractions, the comforts, The slow trade of passion for position. "We're not collapsing," he wrote. "We're drifting." That distinction haunted me. Jorge believed reform wasn't about policies. It was about posture, about hearts, about returning to the uncomfortable intimacy of the gospel. That's why he never elevated those who wanted control. He searched for those who could still kneel, who still wept in private, who still paused at the pain of others. And when he spoke of Cardinal Tagle, it was always with this measure in mind. He listens, Jorge once told me, not to respond, but to understand. That, for Jorge, was rarer than brilliance. Rare enough to notice, rare enough to worry about. Because Rome has a way of sanding down the soul until all that's left is survival. I watched how Tagle began to rise in global conversations. I saw his name appear more and more, on headlines, in whispers, across conclave speculation. But I didn't hear strategy in Jorge's voice when he talked about him. I heard warning, a holy kind of warning. "Rome has teeth," he once told me. "If you're not armored, you bleed." He knew that better than anyone. And yet he still believed, still hoped. He never doubted Tagle's goodness. He doubted whether goodness alone was enough. That kind of honesty doesn't come from theory. It comes from scars, from battles fought in silence behind Vatican walls. There was a time when I asked Jorge directly, "Do you think he'll be next?" He didn't answer with a yes or no. He just looked away and said, "If the church is ready for someone like him, then maybe." And after a pause, "But if it isn't, pray they don't choose him." That contradiction stayed with me. It wasn't a comment on Tagle's worthiness. It was a sober reminder that the right person at the wrong time can be crushed by the very grace he carries. Jorge had seen the price, and he knew. Sometimes the calling comes not to crown a man, but to crucify him. Leadership in the church, Jorge always believed, is a kind of crucifixion. Not the bloody public spectacle, the quiet one, the invisible one, where your private heartbreaks must never interfere with your public resolve, where your prayers are soaked in doubt, but your homilies shine with certainty, where the world celebrates you while you quietly mourn what it cost. Jorge carried that weight. I watched it, and I know he feared that a man like Tagle, so pure in heart, so visible in compassion, might not be given the tools or the room to survive that kind of pressure intact. He didn't speak these things to discourage. He spoke them to prepare, because Jorge knew that the papacy is not a prize, it's a wound, a sacred one, a burden that demands the kind of strength the world cannot see. And I think that's why he chose to speak to me about Tagle, not as a strategist, not as a pope, but as a brother who had seen fire and didn't want another to walk into it alone. He never said, "He should be pope." He said, "If it is him, I hope he remembers who he is before they tell him who he must become." That's what Rome does. It renames you. Jorge's fear was that it might also unmake you. So now, as I sit in this strange quiet, listening again to the rising chatter, to the projections and speculations, I find myself praying, not for a decision, but for a discernment, for the church to remember the sound of Christ's voice, the one who cried, the one who washed feet, the one who never sat above but beside. If Tagle becomes the next pope, it must not be because of popularity or progress. It must be because we are ready to follow someone who doesn't lead from a throne, but from his knees. And if we're not ready for that, then no choice, no conclave, can save us. And now I've said what I had held in my heart for so long. I did not speak to influence the church, nor to shape opinion. I spoke because silence was no longer faithful. I spoke because I remembered a brother who walked quietly, carried burdens without complaint, and taught me that greatness in the kingdom of God is measured not by visibility, but by vulnerability. This story is not just about Jorge. It's about the kind of leadership our world so desperately needs. Leadership shaped not by ambition but by compassion, not by control, but by presence, not by charisma, but by character. We are entering a time of deep spiritual decision. And whether or not you sit in Vatican halls, you are part of that discernment. Because the church is not a building, it is not a conclave, it is not a collar, it is the body of Christ, and every heartbeat matters. I ask you to pray, not just for who comes next, but for who we must become as followers of Jesus. Pray that we are no longer impressed by crowns, but moved by the cross. Pray that we don't mistake power for purpose. Pray that we choose leaders who weep for the world before they speak to it. If this message stirred something in you, if you heard truth, even in the tremble of my voice, then I invite you to walk deeper. Don't just listen, live it. Don't just admire the gospel, follow it. And if you're searching for direction in a world filled with noise, start here. Subscribe to this channel and follow Jesus. Stay close to voices that lead you back to humility, to compassion, to truth. Let this be more than content. Let it be your calling. And let our shared faith become something that moves not just through your screen, but through your life. We're building something here, something honest, something sacred. Not a platform for popularity, but a place for presence. A space where testimonies like mine can meet hearts like yours. And together, we can remember what matters most. So if you're ready to walk this journey not as a spectator, but as a disciple, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you. This world doesn't need more noise, it needs more witnesses. Be one. Speak with tenderness. Lead with truth. And when you're unsure of the way forward, come back to this moment, to this voice, to this story. Let it remind you that the church is still alive when love leads the way. Thank you for sitting with me through all of this, for listening not just with your ears but with your heart. I don't take your time lightly, and I don't see you as an audience. I see you as family, as fellow travelers on this sacred road, and I hope you'll stay, because the story isn't over. It's just beginning. Until next time, stay rooted, stay real, and stay close to the one who leads with nail-scarred hands. I'll see you again soon. Keep the faith, and keep walking.